Hey guys, my name is Kevin Carr, and this is my channel, Software Kevin Carr, with the Anybody Can Code series. Today we're going to be talking with Zack Burgess, and he's going to be detailing his coding journey, how he's gotten to where he is today. So Zack, I want you to take the floor. Please tell me about your background and how you got into coding.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I've been coding for about 9 years now. I started in college. I was choosing a major of what to actually major in, and there was a degree called computer science and engineering. And growing up, my neighbor as a kid, he was an anesthesiologist, and he loved computers. And he showed me how to build computers from the ground up, like putting a motherboard, installing the operating system onto the hard drive, etc. And I knew that I wanted to be an engineer. And so I chose this major, computer science and engineering, thinking that, okay, I like computers, I know I want to be an engineer, this is the one for me. And I didn't really understand what it was until about my junior year, that this is software engineering is what this kind of sets you up to learn. And so my freshman year, I went to the Ohio State University, and I was there for a year. I'm from Oklahoma, and that's where I first started off. And I ended up transferring universities to the University of Oklahoma. Yeah, some different reasons. And I did a bachelor's and a master's degree in computer science. And I'll say this, there's so many stories kind of learning to code for the first time. At one point in time, I didn't think I wanted to be a software engineer or to do this major. The first time I ever coded back at Ohio State, it was in C, maybe a little bit of C++, but it was mostly in C. And it was incredibly frustrating, and it just hurt my mind. I did not understand the syntax. I didn't understand what an array was, pointer, and it was so foreign. What a comment was, it was so foreign to me. And the output of an issue, right, of compiling, I didn't understand that. And then when it actually runs, you get a segmentation fault. It was so, in the moment, hurting because I didn't know like what any of this meant. I got through that course, and about my junior year, so I started getting better at it. It takes some time, you stick with it, and eventually it becomes a little bit easier. What I learned with that, doing C, is that this is the kind of like the most raw you're going to get, right? So if you start off doing like a Java or a Python, you might not have these initial errors that you do with trying to compile on the command line and then run the program also from the command line. But if you stick through it, these concepts do get a little bit easier. And even after starting to get pretty good at it, I was making some excellent grades my freshman and sophomore year after that first time doing C. I still thought, maybe I should move into a different major, one that for me I thought was more businessy, but still engineering, and I was thinking industrial engineer. And fortunately, my dad was like, no, you're doing good at this, stick it out, get that technical degree, the most technical you can get. And I ended up, finishing off a bachelor's in it as well as a master's. And my goal out of college was to go work at one of these top tech companies, right? So I joined Yahoo right after college to work as a software engineer. But there's not really a pathway to get from, I was basically at a football school, University of Oklahoma, in the middle of the country, to Silicon Valley. And whenever you're going to go interview, or at least get an interview at these big tech companies, you have to have some entrepreneurship on your resume to really stand out with some of the other candidates that they're looking at. And so, having great grades is a start, but that's still not enough. And what I ended up doing my really last 2 years of college, so I did 1 year of graduate school, and then 1 year before that, I made a campus events app. So this was at university. And the problem on campus that I identified was that student organizations, they wanted to advertise their events, but there's not a central place to advertise them on campus, right? There's like flyers and Facebook groups and tabling, as they called it, but there's not one place, email chains. And then students, they didn't really know where to go find events because, again, it's a scattered location. And so that was this platform that identified that, there's a need here. And I led a small team of students, and we created a campus events app. And in that process, that's where I learned how to do product management for like a greenfield project, as well as becoming really a skilled engineer versus a high potential student. And I wrote our iOS app. Doing that allowed me to be able to interview at one of these tech companies, get the interview in the first place. Right? I've shown this entrepreneurship. And then having actually written code, on a real project, not just like a class project. Like this is a real thing. That gave me the basically the intuition, right, where I could solve a problem on a whiteboard in the moment. And when I combined that skill, right, of writing an iOS app, plus there was this book called Cracking the Coding Interview. I used that religiously for a few months to practice these exams, right, these questions. Combine those two together, that gave me not just the confidence, but the actual competence to interview and ultimately land a role at Yahoo. And I remember my hiring manager. He was like, Zach, you're rusty, is how he called my skills. But I wrote a passionate packet. The packet is what they called what they're submitted to. At the time it was Marissa Meyer, to get you over the hump. I feel fortunate. I think having doing what's called Avinity, that was the campus events app, plus a little bit of charisma, plus having the actual skill, that gave me just enough to land a role at Yahoo. And when I was there for a little bit over 4 years. I earned a couple promotions, becoming a senior software engineer. And the way that happened is you're aggressive. Nothing is outside of your domain, right? Like if there's a problem in front of you, it's your problem now. Like you own it. I think that's the big thing. It's like owning whatever comes your way. And there's a lot of leadership with that. And I did back end, I did front end, full stack on a business-to-business team, software as a service. Having that mentality of owning the problem and then combine a little bit of product management of wanting to go and talk to those users and then voice your opinion. I think that's something that engineers aren't always doing, is voicing their opinion. Some do, but you definitely stand out by asking those higher level questions, right, than just like the basics of how to do something. As an engineer, it's all about how you're going to do something, but you can not only own that, but think a little bit more of like, well, why are we trying to build this? What are we trying to build for? Those use cases that will allow you to separate yourself, or at least distinguish yourself, and be picked to do projects that were beyond just the coding itself.
So I was wondering if you kind of go a little deeper, if you have any advice to new developers, how they find the necessary skills to get a project completed and deployed.
Yeah, doing Avinity, that was, if I didn't do that, I would not be at Yahoo. I would not have got to Silicon Valley. I don't think I would have had the mindset to think a little bit bigger than whatever has kind of been presented to you, by your manager or by some team member in your team. And so doing one of these projects that's essential. You have to do this if you want to distinguish yourself and be more than what a book can show you to do. So how do you choose a project like this? One, it's hard, right? Like there's no doubt about it. But the fact is you look around for something that you need to work on. What is something that's like, what's a problem that's around you, right? And as a student, that was a problem that I saw. I personally wanted to attend more student events, more events that were for students. And that was where, being in that setting, I was basically scratching my own itch. And that's the great thing about learning to code here, is that you can do a project that is scratching your own itch, right? Whereas if you're strictly doing that, let's say you want to make money and create a business, well, yeah, you need to scratch your itch potentially, but there's so much more that you also have to do, right, to actually make a business. And that's like the one nice factor here is when you're learning to code, you don't have to worry about everything else that a business also needs. You just need to get in there, understand the problem, define the problem, and go tackle it via your coding skills.
Mhm.
And I'm assuming that if you're learning to code, that you've taken some time off of, say, at work, or you're not expecting to like instantly make money off of this new skill that you're trying to develop, because it does take time to do that. And so that's where I would start off with is, hey, what is in your vicinity that you would like to solve? And from that, go solve it. And there might be other people that you need to bring in, right? So I had a backend engineer that was also a student, a designer as well. She was a graphic designer student. These were all great for leadership and for product management. If it gets to that point, then absolutely do it. But you don't need to have all these other resources at your disposal. You need to identify something that's in your vicinity and go try to tackle it.
You had mentioned cracking the coding interview, using it to prepare for your interviews. I was wondering if you kind of detail a little bit more how difficult a lot of these coding interviews can be, because I know, like my personal history, I had a lot and underestimated how difficult it was to prepare for anything. It almost took me a year to get decent and good at it. It was consistent practice.
Yeah, it's another great question, because what you're building, right, is not necessarily the way that you're going to interview. They're not one-to-one. And so, for example, when I built the iOS app, it was in Objective-C.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Objective-C is very used. It's really lengthy, the way that you actually type and write things out. In an interview, if you're not interviewing, to be an iOS developer, you're probably not going to be writing in Objective-C. And when you're preparing for these interviews, you want to be able to look back and see an actual answer, right? So Java was the language in which cracking the coding interview is in. And I would recommend choosing one language and only one. Don't try to do Swift or Objective-C and Java and Python and whatever other language you've heard of. Instead, I would focus on one particular language in which that you would be able to practice these interviews with.
Mm-hmm.
So after I had written the iOS app, I had decent understanding of how to write code. But then when it became time to actually interview, to pass the interviews, I pushed the Objective-C syntax to the side and focused on Java. I said, okay, I'm going to pick Java. The other interviewers probably know Java as well. And when I look in the back of the book to look at a solution, I can actually compare what I wrote to what is actually Java and get in the mindset of what tools are available in Java. Like there are already some built-in functions that I can use on the fly. And so choosing one language and sticking that and becoming an expert in one language is going to be much more valuable than having a shallow understanding of several languages, but you're not able to think all the way through a problem because you haven't dove in detail. So I would choose one language, right? In this case, I chose Java because it's the most commonly used one. You don't have to use that. At some point, just do what's easiest, what's pragmatically useful.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one big takeaway that I had when applying and passing these interviews.
I would also recommend Java or Python, and whichever of those languages you think is the best. Both those languages have built-in data structures and methods to adequately handle these data structures and algorithm questions. So, for example, instead of the downsides of using JavaScript in your interviews is let's say you have a heap pattern question where you have to find the minimum k numbers in an array. In JavaScript, you would actually have to build your own heap class, while in Java and Python it's built in by default. The good thing about those two languages, Java and Python, they're almost universally accepted anywhere you interview. Like everyone's going to know how to do at least those two languages, and they're pretty easy to read. Now, if you kind of compare the two, like Python's a little bit easier to read as a beginner, probably easier to interview as a lot of kind of clear methods. On the other hand, Java's really good, I think, because it makes you really think about the inputs and outputs because it is a compiled language. When, let's say you're doing like a recursive function, it makes a lot of sense. Like, okay, what is actually the output of this? Is it going to be a void where I return nothing? Or am I actually specifically going to return like an integer or something like that? Why is this useful? Well, if you use or call that function name, you have to return something if you're returning an integer. So it's all these little things you have to like really think about your code, which is why I kind of transitioned from Python to Java. It's making me really think out at the start of the process of a question and just coding in general. And it's a lot more fun. I'll be honest. I tried to first learn Java when I was starting to code, and I actually probably quit trying to learn for a year and a half. So it's maybe not the best language to learn at first, but it does teach you a lot of good principles.
Java, as you're saying, has a lot of built-in functions and libraries, but there's also a lot of flexibility into it as well, right? Where pointers are not necessarily exposed, but they do exist under the hood. And having an understanding of what compilation is, and then running that versus more of a script language like Python, at least knowing be able to contrast those two gives you that much more fundamental understanding of what's going on.
I don't want to say like you can get sloppy with Python, but you can. It is easier in some ways. Like I do miss some things about Python when I am coding Java. For example, it's really easy to create nested double arrays in Python. It's just a one-line list comprehension. In Java, you have to initialize the double nested array and then also use arrays.fill. It's similar, but it's just you understanding the base methods and attributes of the different languages.
I want to touch on one more thing, about these built-in libraries. When you interview at one of these big tech companies, they are basically interviewing someone that could write one of these libraries. And what I mean by that is, yes, there's built-in for loops, or there's a built-in heap, but understanding how that heap is made in the first place is what's going to be a little bit more important. And you're not necessarily going to be asked to write a heap or to create I don't think they're going to ask you to write a red-black tree, but yeah, you're going to be like a Google fellow to do that on the spot. That's that's hard. That's really hard.
Well, no, I definitely know what you mean. There's actually a pretty popular question: implement your own LRU cache, and that combines like you basically have to have a deep knowledge of doubly linked list and hash maps in order to solve it. So, like you're saying, you should probably spend some time like implementing these base data structures just to get a feel for how it is to code these bigger classes.
That's right. And I think the takeaway here is whenever you're using, let's say, the heap function, like that built-in heap data structure, have an idea of what's happening behind the scenes. Don't just like assume it's this like black box of the word heap and that's what it does, but like know underneath the hood of like roughly what's happening, because going through that thought process is the fundamentals that these companies want.
How important do you think it is for a software engineer to really learn how to improve their communication levels?
That's how you distinguish yourself from your peers, is your communication. Now, the first one is being able to take a pause. Right? Hear the question, take a pause, ask some follow-up questions if needed. You don't have to immediately give an answer, right? So the thing is, and this was interesting whenever I first joined, I would hear the engineers, some of my fellow engineers, they ask questions, and they would pause and then answer. And I thought, I'm going to be so much of a better communicator, and I'll just have the answer on the tip of my tongue. Like at all times, I'll know my code so well. That's not realistic, because whenever you're asked, by let's say a director or a lead, they're asking tough questions. They already know the answers that can be reeled off the top of your tongue. They already know those answers, and they're not asking you questions that are a one-liner question. Maybe you might be asking one-liner questions, but they're not going to be. And so the way that you are able to communicate is by understanding fundamentally what's happening. And it takes time to learn it, let's say, a new code base, and to get familiar with it. Knowing what's happening behind the scenes, and the interview process, preparing for these interviews gets you into that mindset. And don't be afraid to take that pause, think through your answer a little bit, and then give it.
One of my favorite teachers in high school, IB, History of the Americas teacher, he always had that habit where, like you're saying, he'd always pause before he'd say something, because you could tell he was thinking about how he wanted to phrase it. And you're right, I don't think it's a knock against anybody to like think before you speak, because just like if you were to jumpstart, like a race, you might stumble, but actually taking your time and focusing will help you clearly communicate what you're trying to say and think about it. You also look at like grandmasters in chess. They think, unless they're playing like blitz, but they usually like think like long term how that chess move is going to affect the long term strategy. So yeah, no issue taking a little pause before you immediately give an answer, and it's totally fine to say I don't know, but I'll find out, because I think maybe not the worst thing, but you shouldn't feign like you know something that you don't, because then you're setting up expectations that aren't realistic.
Yeah, and especially when you're like say brand new to a team organization, if you start just popping off like whatever comes to your mind and it's halfway thought out, like, that's not a good way to start your relationship. It's better to know what you're talking about completely and interject when that moment is right, than to like just just to be heard. Like you don't want to just be heard. That's a low level thinking in the business world.
For the coding interviews as well. And this article I'm about to mention, I'll link it in the description. But on Blind, which is essentially like a forum, like an anonymous forum for tech workers in the U.S. primarily. The title was called "Confessions of a FANG Manager," like a FANG hiring manager, and he was saying that a lot of candidates fail because they refuse to listen to the questions being asked. And a lot of time, these coding interviews, of course, are trying to determine your coding ability, but they're really trying to determine, hey, is this person someone that like listens, I can communicate with, work together on a problem to solve? Because a lot of people, they'll either jump straight into answering the question without understanding the actual question prompt and end up creating a solution that doesn't address at all the question statement, asking clarifying questions about like input, edge cases. Oh, am I thinking about this correctly? Is this approach I'm going to take, is this where you want me to go? And he's saying that people who are actually in the present moment and focused usually are the ones he wants to hire.
That's an amazing point. Is this person actually listening? Are they wanting to listen? Have you chosen to be engaged? That is so critical. And I went through an interview just the other day, which was interesting in that they were asking me like, what are my strengths and weaknesses as an engineer? Now I give an answer just like my strengths for sure, and then but the question is like, are you also going to answer the second part of the weaknesses? Now there were two things that I did in this moment. The first one is I had a pen and paper, and I wrote down strengths and I wrote down weaknesses. So I knew that I was going to hit both of those questions. And then when it came to the weaknesses, I reframed it of, okay, I don't necessarily consider this a weakness, but here's a contrast of an area that I do not have expertise in. And I gave an example of, in my case, I don't have any expertise in building a distributed system. And in showing that was writing it down so I knew I would answer it, and then framing it in such a way that got to the root cause of like what they're asking for. I think was the right thing to do.
I think what that question's ultimately asking is like, is this person honest and realistic and aware of themselves? Someone who doesn't think anything's wrong or they can't prove anything, that's not someone you want to work with.
Agreed, because you can pass over it. That hiring manager's gonna have the same thing of like, hey, are they listening to me? Is this person very truthful? But that's exactly right. He gave a compliment like, oh yeah, thank you for being honest with what he said. You can interpret weakness in so many different ways, right? You can also think about it from a personality perspective. Like, what's your weaknesses as a person? In this case, it was a weakness as an engineer. So there's so many different ways that you can interpret these, and asking clarifying questions again. Like after you said that, you could do a follow up of, hey, is there anything else that you want me to dive into? I think that's totally appropriate during the interview.
One that just came off the top of my head is, would you like me to clarify ways I'm actually working towards improving those weaknesses? Or you can just interject those like as you're telling those weaknesses too.
No, because I've also thought through, because I've been doing interviews as well. Some of these questions, they will be behavioral based. And one that I've received a couple times is, what are your greatest strengths and what are your greatest weaknesses? And what I noticed is that my greatest strength is also my greatest weakness. And for me, I've identified that as, quote, being a bulldozer. And when I'm looking on a problem, it's like me and the problem, I can bulldoze my way through it. I will ask all the questions, get all the answers, and shake it and chew it up and spit it out. until I get that little nugget that I'm looking for. And it's very powerful. I use that. That's how I did Affinity. That's how I got from middle of the country football school to middle Silicon Valley and a couple of promotions, is being a bulldozer. But the weakness of this is that when you're working with an individual, and it's not you and the problem, but you and another person, you can't bulldoze your way through a conversation, or at least you can't do that in the long run. You'll burn the person out, basically. Consciously choosing, and at least being aware that, I need to give the person space, and I'll allow that moment to be there where you can listen to what they're actually asking for, is just how you finesse that, for me, that bulldozing mentality, where you keep it's in the background, but you're not doing that with the person.
Zach, what have you seen become like best elements that you've seen on a good team, and how do you cultivate that in your own team?
There's kind of two things I think about. The first one is my interactions with other engineers, and not being a bulldozer, right? Where I could have a solution in mind at the very beginning, but that's not necessarily the right solution. And it comes down to framing. So let's say I'm working with an engineer, and I've, let's say, collected the information of what the users need. I actually have real feedback on what users are asking for, as well as my own synthesis. And bringing that to an engineer and speaking at, here's the problem level, and respecting that an engineer has expertise in that domain, that specific domain, and having a conversation not from like me to him as a solution or me to her as a solution, but here's the opportunity that we're going after, and how can we get there together, is the way that I generally frame it. And I think that's very important, that I'm able to, one, respect an engineer for their time and their expertise, but also show leadership of like where we want to go, and like, why am I bringing this bringing this problem to an engineer. So that would be the first one. And then the second one is being able to ask those tough questions, those higher level questions. I think that's really important. Is as a leader, you're basically going to be asked tough questions. Like it's kind of the definition of being a leader, is being able to handle those. And for me, not being embracing that basically your feet are against the fire. Right? You can shut somebody down for sure, you can, but it's not sustainable, and ultimately it'll be a party of one. Yeah, it's really important to have a context. Sometimes it's important, like as a product manager, to bring an engineer to the customer to see what they're feeling as well, right? The frustration that the customer's having, that additional context where you don't even have to even say anything. You just let the moment speak for itself. And I think that's where a great product manager or just a great leader will balance. Like whenever additional context needs to happen, yes, we can give it verbally, but also bring them to the whatever person or event that you're getting your context from. Share that. Ultimately, build a better product when the entire team understands what the problem that you're working on actually is.
For you being in product management, where do you see product management, the field, changing in the next 5 years?
Product management is, some people say it's like the golden age. I've been wanting to be product management since I did Affinity, right, in college. And so I've been following it to some extent, right, even while doing engineering. I keep up with some of the thought leadership. The way I'm really thinking about product management is being someone that is not an order taker from customers, but is a trusted consultant, a trusted advisor, where they're coming to you with their problems, and you're spending all of your time understanding their problems, and then taking that and synthesizing it and bringing it to your team. Basically, you have a team behind you that can solve these problems that you've been interfacing with that individual. And I think product management, that's like one definition of it. But I think product management is going to grow a little bit more, where instead of it just being, let's say, the PM that's interacting with that user or with that customer, I think there's going to be more design as well as, let's say, a team lead of an engineer in that, and have this more trifecta conversation with that customer so that you have all the angles. I call it like the full stack team: design, front end, back end, design, engineering, product, engaged with that user. I think there's going to be more collaboration done with the PM as well as the design and at least the engineering lead.
For your coding journey and product management journey, are there any book recommendations or YouTube channels that you recommend people follow?
Yeah, absolutely. So for engineering, cracking the coding interview, Gail, I think Lockman McDonald, that book was awesome. That helped me so much. I 100% recommend it. That's how I got the job at Gail, plus doing the So that would be my book recommendation there. For product management, there's two sides I'm thinking of. So the interview side, there's a website called tryexponent.com. Tryexponent.com. I use that website to practice product manager interviews, and I also purchased some sessions, some paid sessions with PM coaches to help me get over the hump to actually land an offer. So I highly recommend using that website in preparation for a PM role. And then as a thought leader, someone that I follow within product management is Teresa Torres, last name of Torres. Torres. Teresa, she's awesome. That's who I'm using to understand more of the product space. As well as I have a Medium newsletter, like a blogging newsletter that comes to me every week. That's all about product. It comes every day, actually. And I just find myself gravitating to reading that blog. And that's also been a little bit of my thought process of like, hey, like why am I transitioning from engineering to product? Like, what is it? And I naturally find myself going and reading those product manager blogs, product blogs more than I do an engineering blog. Do some exploration for yourself, what sources that you want to follow. But these are some good starters.
And that's actually a pretty good piece of advice, or like a nugget of wisdom. Whatever resources like for your career you find yourself gravitating towards, like maybe that's the next step in your career you want to take. So if you see yourself reading a lot of back-end engineering blogs and you're a front-end engineer, maybe that's the next step for you. It might not be definitive, but it could be a good leading indicator like you, hey, I want to go more from engineering to product management.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I re-listened to Steve Jobs' commencement speech, 2005 commencement speech, and he was suggesting something very similar as like notice like what you're falling in love with and just go into it. And that's another angle of looking at the same problem.
And of course, I want to thank you for taking the time to be interviewed today and sharing your story. I mean, the floor is yours if you want to share like any like just information at all, or like plug your social media links or like LinkedIn links. Like the floor is yours, Zach. Thank you again.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. I really enjoyed this. I know a couple places you can find me. So LinkedIn.com/Zack Burgess, ZackBurgess. And then my Instagram is Z is for Zach.
Zach, thank you again. Hope you guys have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you guys. Cheers. See you soon.